I'm Kira Cleveland, and this is Human Intelligence. With my co-host, Ned Hayes, we talk about the importance of human creativity in the age of AI. Welcome to the future. So we want to welcome Valerie Veatch to today's show. Valerie is a director, writer, editor, and producer who made her feature debut at the 2012 Sundance Film Festival with At the Zoo, Me at the Zoo for HBO. Her follow-up, Love Child, also premiered at Sundance, making Valerie the youngest director ever to debut 2 feature films at the festival. And now she's back at Sundance with Ghost in the Machine. It's a self-funded investigative essay documentary that excavates the philosophical, cultural, and political forces driving the global AI boom and traces the links between artificial intelligence and eugenics. It asks the really interesting question of who is really building AI, who is being exploited to make it function, and what humans might become on the other side of it. Welcome to the show, Valerie. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I have to say I'm a big fan. I really enjoyed looking up, your history and your work. One thing that you said at one point was that at a certain point, an idea becomes an obsession and then it becomes a movie. And I would love to have you take us back to the beginning of this project. What was the idea that pulled you into making Ghosts in the Machine? Like, what was that moment that really made you think this needs to be a film?
Yeah. So I would say that like my entry point immediately into this topic was a year and a half ago in October. My good friend signed me up for this like low key secret artist work, testing group for this top secret piece of software by OpenAI called Zora. And, you know, I guess at the time I was not actively making films. I have young kids. There's a lot of things about the film industry that are compromised. And so making truthful pieces in that context is difficult, especially about technology. So, because my work tends to go there, I tend to just kind of, I was in a bit of a like, yeah, don't feel like dealing with the film industry mode. But I, within using this kind of generative AI technology, I was like, wow, this is so cool. You can type in, you know, mountain and there's a mountain or whatever. And as a filmmaker, that's super exciting. And then, immediately upon using it, like the dark clouds start to gather of like what I think in Ghost in the Machine kind of stretches out that like the context of all of it. But this huge ick feeling developed of like, the images generated by this software are highly problematic from a kind of just like, if cinema is the intentional production of images, as a feminist, as a woman filmmaker, or just as a person with a rooted point of view in this space, very important to me that is what is going on in the cinematic gesture. But this is a like algorithm and a database just co-opting that gesture, and all the rhetoric around it was like, this is going to elevate filmmaking. Is this going to optimize your? And I was like, okay. So I tried to start talking to OpenAI about like how this was the case, and you know, the long and short of it, the feedback was like, engineers are very focused on certain things, and things that are pro-social are kind of not, are like a non-starter, and it's cringe to be talking about this. And the women in the company do see that there are like, it was like very dramatic in the beginning too. It was like practically porn if it was a woman. I mean, literally, like it was just like it was like
Oh,
shocking. And
God.
then like even when you were dealing with like felt puppets or something, if you were to put in something that was like socioeconomic data, it would produce a certain skin tone, and you can like imagine the available range. And I was like, you can't. But it did look very realistic. Like, especially back then, I was just like, wow, this looks real. And that is playing in the language of cinema, right? Like it's being contextualized as such by Sora, the product. They had this like very Sora Select short film screening thing in Manhattan at the Metrograph, and they flew everyone out, and they wouldn't screen my piece because it was kind of taking the piss of the whole thing. But they like did invite, and I was like, whatever, I'll go and see what this is about. And I was basically came home, and I was like, the whole way that we're talking about this technology is, I don't want to use such dramatic political language as the F word, but like it's definitely like centralized authority, centralized control, centralized resources, and centralized ideology in a way that like I have not seen before. So I started just kind of Googling, and one of the first kind of authors I came across was Dan McQuillan, and he was like, I think his book Resisting AI is amazing, and a really like kind of good framework for how to approach talking about all of this stuff. And, Emily Bender and Alex Hanna's The AI Icon hadn't come out yet, but Emily Bender, I was read about a paper that she wrote with Timnit Gebru and Abeba Brahani. And I started just kind of like emailing these people being like, I am a documentary filmmaker. That's why you should talk to me. Because I was just curious. I wanted to ask them like all these questions. And, one of the kind of central things, and I think what I hope is like and this is when I say it's really productive to do these conversations after the film, because one of the things I think to really pause on and go back to is the moment wherein we decide the machines can think and that this is even like a thing and that it exists inside the context of IQ and rankable intelligence. And oh my God. And then we start to get into resource allocation and the scale of these systems they're developing right now. And it's all like, no, 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 no. Like, this is not
It's
super
such
intelligent. Never going to happen. And the whole kind of AI doom, like, this is going to become so big and replace us in the top of the value of of resource allocation and life on the planet. It's just like, oh my God, no. And it requires us to really be able to kind of push back in broad systemic ways and specific ways and like spiritual ways. But like to do that, I think that means something different for everyone else, every individual, right? So then like having a kind of story that holds all of those pieces, then we can take those into our like life and figure out what they mean and how to reapproach when we hear this huge, massive hype around, technology in general, technological optimism, or like, specifically this AI hype of the Mo.
One thing that you mentioned was the whole like thinking it's alive and real and thinking, right? Ned, you had a really great example or point towards this.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So you might be familiar with classrooms where you start off with, somebody taking a pencil and saying, this is a pencil, this is Timmy the pencil, blah, blah, blah. And having people like respond to that and then cracking the pencil in half and saying, of course, this isn't real. And the point being that we as human beings like to imagine non-conscious things as people. And that really drives AI hype. So, to your point, this is feeding into this kind of cycle of people continuing to add attributes to machines, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back, right, to like the way that we anthropomorphize animals and the kind of totemic religions and, the kind of, I mean, and this is where you could get kind of many ways to approach that conversation of why we do this, but we are always trying to both create this omniscient external authority, but also this kind of external connectedness. And maybe there's like elements of truth there, but to put it on a machine and then to consolidate it into this like, you know, God-like entity is just, it does fit in the pattern of human thinking. I mean, if you were to like kind of white label this phenomena, we'd look at it and we'd be like, well, that looks a lot like the, religious fervor prior to the Crusades, or something, but like it's AI fever instead. And I think to your point, the one thing that I hope people take away from this film is that we do not need to anthropomorphize these systems, and to do so plays into the hands of people who are looking to consolidate power.
Absolutely. So, speaking of consolidating power, the AI doc, which is another documentary that's out right now, talks to some of the power brokers, interviews some of the people who are really driving this conversation forward. And I think gives them a platform, gives them a way of telling their story. And I'm curious if you could, like, of course, you weren't comparing notes with Daniel Kwan, I believe, who created that one, but some people might see your work in conversation with that film. So if your work is in conversation, even unintentionally, what's your work saying in response?
I think that to kind of on the first part of what you were saying, when it comes to what I think I would affectionately call access journalism, there's a phenomena that's happening across the industry, and it's in all, it's not just in documentary, where when folks are covering this space, there is such a imbalance in power. It's a symptom of like the kind of the situation we're in and why the hour is late, right? So anyone who is at all reliant on the system is by nature going to be complicit in the messaging. And that's just how it functions as a business. And I think that, that's what you would hear if you were to talk to someone and say, why did you platform these people? I think that there's like part of it is, well, that's the film everyone's going to recognize as the authoritative piece, because there's just like really funny mentality about this industry. But I think what my film and what I in my own work actively operate against or operate around or just operate outside of is the system. And so if I were to like phone up Sam Altman and say, hey, would you be in this film? Probably wouldn't hear from him, and in fact was told by OpenAI that there's like a third party DEI specialist I can talk to. And that's the last time I heard about DEI initiatives in the industry. And I was like, this is about product functionality, like the hubris of it. So there's a kind of like storyline that a project that encompasses those voices has to carry. And that storyline, how truthful is a film about this technology? If I was like hugging Sam Altman on camera, it's not that I don't have love for every human, but at the same time, I'm not going to, well, at the same time, this, like I go where the story requires, right? Like we're following this story and the story is kind of framing our current moment. And, to be, to kind of like have those folks on camera just feels like a waste of kind of independence that I don't need because they already speak to the media. Like everything they could already say, they've said in like hours of podcasting, and it would be much more truthful and, whatever that would come across to me. So I don't know, a lot of words to say that because I don't care. I don't want to hear from them. I don't want them in my film.
Right. They already have a platform. It's not incumbent on you to give them a further platform. Speaking of which, as we speak today, Elon Musk and Sam Altman are in court arguing about the past and the future of OpenAI. And, they have opinions about this. And before we dig further into the content of your film and the incredible work that you've done there, I'm curious if you had any thoughts about their little argument in court today.
I don't know. I think there's a level of palace intrigue that I understand is interesting. And now I'm in such a mode of like, you wouldn't believe it. I'm like every moment of the day, I'm coordinating screenings. I'm, built audience building. There's a sort of wave behind this message that I really care about. And so I put like nods to the palace intrigue of OpenAI, and that involves subcategory, the subplot with Elon Musk. But I didn't follow it today. The gist of it is uninteresting. And ultimately, I think it exposes more about the kind of financialization of the industry and kind of the more of the venture capital flow of money. And I think it's very fascinating to watch the wealth consolidate. But again, there's kind of tactical things at play every day that I feel like our eyes should be on our local communities, our resources, how those are managed, how those are allocated. And from that will stem how to really create what we need out of like from the situation. But that stuff, yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
I like it could, because when I was making the film, you could make this, you could indulge in that so much. I mean, Ronan Farrow really indulged for a year and a half in that beautifully researched New Yorker piece, right? And then Karen Howe's book is really good, and I wouldn't call that at all. I think that's a very, foundational piece in the space. So it has a space, but
It's such a rich conversation space, right? So,
yeah.
kind of pulling back to talking about your film, in your work, you draw some connections between today's AI enthusiasm and, older ideologies. Like, tell us about those connections.
So it's interesting that on several layers, the kind of phenomena of so the social sciences, racialized hierarchies, and eugenic thinking, all and biology, right? Like all kind of create this algae bloom in in the late Victorian era, and out of that, we get a few gifts that really keep on giving through to today. And, the film goes off on several threads, and you really could go off on like literally 36 more. But the kind of on two main tracks, you have the way that statistics was developed in service of eugenics to measure goals and the ratios of humans on average, and to create averages, and also to create causal agnostic averages. That's like super important, which means that they were not, still to this day, not concerned about a causal axis. And so information is processed in this way that like naturally accrues bias or naturally, regression to the mean, like these things. There's a reason why like it's just this great homogenizing force, right? And also an ideology that's not worried about, is it poverty or is it the color of your skin that creates your educational status and your IQ? Like that they weren't concerned about that is kind of like, I think just it is interesting. And then you also separately, well, related, comma, now semicolon, now you have the concept of measurable intelligence and the G factor. And so you have Francis Galton, you have Carl Pearson, who kind of invents all of the maths. And then you have Charles Spearman, who follows up and really rolls up his sleeves, goes to America and tries to figure out exactly how to put all of this to use when measuring these immigrants, like piling off the boat and like, yeah. So out of that, then we get this kind of post-war contemplation of the computer as a sort of like extended tool of man, and all these people thinking that they might be able to like further reduce intelligence to measurable things. There's a whole kind of thing that you could go into here, but I don't in the film because there's not enough time, and I won't. Well, it is interesting. So just kind of during World War II, when they cleared the Marshall Islands for nuclear testing, and Brett Zenner does great work on this, or he was the one who kind of pointed me to the story. And all of these displaced groups were then studied along the like kind of framework of IQ studies and kind of cognitive testing, and a lot of our kind of tests and systems come from that even. So interesting. So then we arrive at like kind of after World War II, and we have Gilbert Ryle, gets put as the head of the philosophy department at Oxford, which was kind of burgeoning into the psychology department. And he wrote a book called Theory of Mind, which says there's nothing external that animates our bodies. We're just an extension of our kind of meat-like behavior. And so the women, animals, like babies, don't have like the smart minds that like a fully developed kind of like ideated human. But like his godfather was Carl Pearson, the founder of statistics and like the eugenicist. And then his brother was the president of the Eugenic Society. Was he himself a card-carrying eugenicist? Like unclear, but clearly he thought in terms of rankable intelligence and thought from that space. This is really cool. So then I was just looking at Alan Turing, because I was like, I have to put in Turing's thinking machine paper somewhere. Like, where does that fit? And I was looking at it one time and I was like, oh my God, Gilbert Ryle was the editor of the journal where Turing published his thinking machine essay. And then it was the year after Gilbert Ryle's Theory of Mind was published. And then I was like, they were both the same age-ish during the war. They were both kind of from the Ivy League circle, whatever, like kind of like elite circle, education circles. Right, Oxbridge whatever, extended, in England. And so they were obviously during the war, so there's one Gilbert Ryle biographer who's amazing called Michael Kremer in the film, and he lives in Quebec now. He's at the University of Chicago for a long time, and he took the kindness of it as heart to come out of his like retirement schedule to like talk to me a few times. And then he called one time, like my cell phone in the middle of the day in England. I was like, what is this? And he was like, you wouldn't believe it. Because I had postulated to him that like there's no way that Turing and Gilbert Ryle didn't know each other during the war, but he was like, you wouldn't believe it. I just got a paper submitted to review, which I think has come out this spring. I'll have to get the link to it. It just came out about how Gilbert Ryle and Alan Turing, Gilbert Ryle's boss took his team to visit Alan Turing's lab and stay. Like there's like that level of documentation. Turing burned all his letters. We don't know. They were both confirmed bachelors. There's definite kind of crossover there. And I think that's very interesting, where we have out of that kind of environment post-war, when we know about Turing's life, that this would have kind of been a way of thinking about what had just happened and things. And then, Gilbert Ryle kind of coming out of his own need to reduce things to measurable bits. And he's also, there's footage of him in the film, and I'm in contact with that wonderful filmmaker, and he had shot a piece for the BBC with Gilbert Ryle, and Gilbert Ryle does kind of just talk a lot and not say a lot, which was interesting. But so it's anyway, so that's where we get this idea of the ghost in the machine, excuse me. So Gilbert Ryle says that the idea that we don't have a soul and we're just our bodies, the soul is the ghost in the machine. And we move on through kind of the early invention of the transistor and the computer science, the kind of computer fabrication in Silicon Valley, and how these ideas then blossom into the current moment. I could like go on right in so much detail, and I won't because I'm not sorry. But like, yes, it's all very connected, and it's all part of this story that once we zoom out and we look at it, when we understand it, we can then look at this current moment of AI hype, and we can say like, clearly machines can't think. I know they can't because I understand how we got here and I see the point in the context around why, and I can reject that idea when it's being presented to me because there's a lot of people who are like, oh, the doomers, right? Like AI it's an existential risk. It's going to grow legs and crawl out of the computer and become this thing. You're like, I don't really know how is my question. But in the
Yeah.
meantime, predictive policing, that like we have councils in the UK are using this software and they're gathering data from secondary schools and it's playing out in obvious patterns that you think it would, targeting certain people, which we know like drives then engagement from the police and then they get targeted. So all of these algorithms, when like let loose upon the world, have actual harm. And then we also have like the environmental consequences of this idea that you need a hyperscale data center to do something magical. So if we can
Yeah.
project that magical goal is real, and then I think we can have a clear sense of resistance. Anyway, sorry.
No, your point about people having these big, big ideas about what the future could be. I mean, just to name names, Nick Bostrom has been very famous for having all these ideas which extend where things are going to go in kind of bizarre and apocalyptic directions. So the public discourse around AI is kind of collapsing into two camps. It's either utopia or dystopia. Either it's going to be everything for everybody or it's going to be apocalypse, right? And some other thinkers in the field, including the AI doc that's out, foreground those kinds of extreme poles. And your film was very careful in not saying it's going to cure cancer or end all suffering. But the binary is really seductive. So could you speak a little bit about the binary and why you didn't go that direction? I mean, some of the answers are obvious, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, I didn't intentionally know which way to go. I mean, in the beginning, I didn't know the language. I didn't know the nuance of the positions. I knew that AI gave me the ick, and then every day I'd be like, more reasons to just think this is gross. And none of it. And somewhere along the way, you do encounter these folks who are highly concerned with this fantasy story of the computer becoming God. And there's a lot of detail and a couple films coming out that will, I hope, tell the gossipy, the palace intrigue of this story because it's very good. I just have time to get into it in the film, but the way that certain narratives are shaped and spread through what we might call the rationalist community. We talk about effective altruism in the film. These kind of groups that are set up to engage with how we can help humanity are also kind of spaces where this fantastical rhetoric has really taken hold. And personally, for me, like part of the reason I made this film is like I want to engage with those groups because they do have the ick. Maybe we can all learn tactically how to behave in ways that are useful for resisting. And sitting around wringing our hands about an AI god that's never coming is certainly not it. So I think though it does take a level of criticality. Yeah, or what's that?
I said self-awareness, maybe?
Yes. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, that's a very direct way of saying it, but I think, that's one of the reasons why it's very interesting to me that there are not very many, women aren't often asked questions about what the future holds, right? And like, we're not really like the ones who are like giving predictions about technology or asked to tell stories about technology. Like nobody funded my film. Right? No, like our trailer has like a fraction of the views that their trailer that that the mainstream kind of story has. Like the system is very good at perpetuating itself, and there's kind of a like sorry, so what was your question?
The question I had was, if we aren't going for one of these extremes,
Right.
what's the
Oh,
middle
you were saying
platform?
why is the polarizing thing so seductive, or why are those stories sell?
Or if we don't become polarized, what
Yeah.
are the other options?
And you had said also the self-awareness thing, like, right. Like, so it's important to have like embodied stories that come from many different positions. And I would hope to have like more filmmakers kind of taking on the kind of story of what we're talking about when we're dealing with this consolidated technology and political power. If the story's not the AI super god, The story is a series of choices that we make together as a society about how to allocate resources, what we want the state to function as, and what we want it to do, and how we want to govern in that. And like, I think that participatory democracy and the political systems we have right now have a lot going for them. And so how do we reinforce them, and how do we, kind of use our ability to connect to do that? But certainly like not surrendering to the infrastructure build out that's happening right now. That's an interesting kind of part of this, I think. And so it's just about finding local ways to like understand the resources.
I love that point on kind of pulling it back into local and community and not relying on systems at large. Along those lines, those systems have been really pushing AI being labeled in everything, right? Like you look everywhere and there's some label on AI. But one of the things that we've been exploring is this idea that we need to declare something as human. Like, where's the human in this conversation? And, would a label or a signal or a way for creators and audiences to recognize that something was made by a human and choose human work? If we had that, do you think it would matter? Would people care?
Yeah, I hope so. And that's a complex proposition, right? Like, let's talk about what is AI made content, what isn't. And it's very cool. I don't want to like say too much because it's not, we've been talking to a software group that makes like prominent editing software, and we're talking about like how like there are current initiatives in the industry to be able to have the camera have a certain kind of watermark that the post process reads, so you can say like, yes, this came from this camera. And then also, like, at what point along the workflow can we opt in or out of these technologies? Like, you could say no AI was used in writing a script, no AI was used in da 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 da. And they were like, okay, well, what do you mean when you say no AI? And I said, no tokens engaged. Yes, I'm happy to
Ooh.
run color correction algorithms locally on my computer, like as I do. That is great. It's not using a hyperscale data center to like hallucinate information into my media. But any point at which I could engage a token, which is kind of the whole business model around these software companies now, I want to be able to refuse that. And so that's kind of like what I would want, how I would frame kind of thinking about the use of this stuff is it's like, are you engaging tokens? If you are, just don't. Like, just like try a different kind of compute, try a different way to run it. Like, open a spreadsheet. Like use Excel. Like that's like the same as
Yes.
most of what we're doing there. And then in terms of using AI as a writing tool, and this is fascinating. There's a paper that just came out that like shows empirically that when you use autofill, it shifts your political messaging. And you can imagine like which way it would shift, right? So like that seemingly helpful, seemingly basic thing that doesn't totally co-opt your intention because it's just finishing the gist of what you started. Obviously it does. And I think that like having a clarity with your voice and your language and honing your ability to communicate should always be the human goal, right? So like, why are we allowing any interaction with something that generates something for us to like build gray matter in our brain, because it does that, when you like use these systems. So I think it's really like cool not to, and important not to. And I think in a few years cognitively it'll be like smoking, like, but it's also up to us to continue to articulate these systems for what they are, and so one of the things that I hope this film does is give people permission to refuse AI, and it won't set you back in your career. Like you're not gonna like fall behind. You're not gonna lose out in some great, transcendent rapture that humanity will go through with AI. That won't happen. What you will do is you will retain your critical thinking skills and your grounded sense of your own truth and how power actually functions around you. And you will have built, community, even if to like, it might feel cringe to like go to your local garden, like meet up, but like do it. And then, build on that. And then we can all spend our time doing that right now. And, in 10 years, we will look back and we will kind of giggle at this feverish, embarrassing AI hype.
Well, so it's a fever. It's an interesting moment. I've observed it feels a lot like the beginning of the internet when everybody was hyped about like, you can go online now. And now we're just like, yes, I can go online. And it's also slow in the customer service line online. Like we've shifted various things to online versus being offline, but they aren't necessarily always better. Ted Chiang, the famous novelist and short story writer, has pointed out that he doesn't feel like the internet made much better. And I'm just curious about your perspective on, in 5, 10 years, will we look back and say, what will we say at that point about what we're now calling AI, these kinds of technologies?
Ted Chiang is doing the Q&A at our Seattle Film Festival screenings in 2 weeks with Emily Bender.
Fantastic.
That's going to be great.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. They're amazing. Okay, so yeah, well, I think that there's this perception around what the technology is because the icons have sparkles, you know, and
Magic.
or like, agentic behavior, like open claw. None of it's real, and it's funny because it's like the technology itself is just a symptom or a reflection of our society, right? So like optimizing, maxing, you know, manifesting what you want with these like prompting tools. Like there's nothing holding you if you're not like vibe creating. Like what are you doing? It's just the only kind of like like I can kind of understand that seductive narrative for usage, but as soon as you kind of like realize if you're used to creating things that these things don't work, then you don't use them as tools, and I just think we'll find it embarrassing. I think it will just everyone will like slowly forget about it, hopefully, like the Tamagotchi, and the thing is, but then unfortunately, it's like there's a whole ideology around it, and that's the thing that will cement. Like same as interesting you bring up the early internet, because actually, if you look back at what that was, it was a fiber optic infrastructure land grab. Like that's where like it's always in the infrastructure, these like so-called bubbles or these software bubbles are like underneath all of that money. It's not software companies, it's infrastructure, it's compute. Selling compute is the name of the game. And it seems like whenever there's
Right.
surplus capital, using that to create this monstrous compute is sort of a way to, it's silly. It is very silly.
Well, just a little bit of history there, which I'm sure you know, Valerie, but the big land grab for fiber optics that telcos invested in at the early stage of the internet took 25 to 30 years to actually recoup their investment. They did eventually get there, but the huge investment that even somebody like Mark Andreessen has pointed out recently, that took decades to get to. So I wonder the huge investment that we're making now in data centers, that's not actually going to result in trillions of dollars of worth next year. But
Yeah.
30 years from now, maybe the data centers people will actually make their money back. But the problem is
Well, I
they're all
would
trying to make their
pause
money.
and say, what's the business case for that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, well, how are they proposing to make their money back?
Hmm.
I know. So many really smart questions and, things they don't have answers for.
But also, like, there's a lot of dystopic trends that could lead toward. Like there's like huge data centers going up next to huge detention centers
Yeah.
in these like tech zones that like the Biden administration created. There's a lot of labor involved in these systems, but it's now become disenfranchised, disembodied labor, but it's still labor, but like underpaid. So there's a kind of like drift into like a lot of the exploitive labor practice that these technologies enable, and that could be maybe how they make their money back. But even then, it's like, so you can place your entire workforce with algorithms, but like, who's your customer now?
Mhm.
like,
Right.
like,
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Not a
and the
sustainable.
mutterings of universal income feel very bleak, and kind of incoherent. And the fact that I mean, I am so excited. I have to read Naomi Klein's book, right? Like her new book about end times fascism.
Yes.
And this whole kind of the people creating the infrastructure are also like kind of creating their own exit, and like the ideology around that. I think that's kind of a piece to this.
Yeah.
Honestly, all of these connections that so many people don't see mainstream, around the exploitation and the eugenics and the fascism, that's part of what makes your work so important. And so, Valerie, I just want to say it's been extraordinary having this conversation with you. Ghost in the Machine is exactly the kind of work this moment needs, something historical, honest, and deeply human. From here, for our listeners, where can people, find the film, follow your work, and stay connected with what you're doing next?
So our website, notai.com, has a fantastic set of pages that have our event. You can find a screening near you. In September, we're going to be on PBS in America and on PBS documentaries on YouTube. And so it will be available quite broadly, and we're looking to build a lot of engagement and momentum toward that. So we're super excited about that. We have we're doing a theatrical run in the UK and a limited run in the US. And then I can't announce it yet, but in July, we'll have a fun announcement around some more availability for the film. And then currently, everyone can watch it on Kinema. And you can schedule a community screening. There's a lot of different formats and options for how to bring it to your community. And if you email us, we are really excited to kind of support however we can with any kind of community screenings engagements, because I think that's really at the heart of this. And then we also have a really fun kind of like college tour pitch working up that like would be very exciting to kind of use this film to create spaces for engagement and extended engagement around a lot of the themes that the film talks about.
Great.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
That's our website, basically.
Yeah, appreciate your time. And we will look forward to screening the film here on June 20th here in Portland. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Okay.
You can find out more about any of these news items and hear the complete interview on the extended premium version of our podcast at humanintelligence.news. Today's episode was produced by Ned Hayes and engineered by Muhammad Adnan. Our analog-only human-themed music was created for the Human Intelligence podcast by Josh Pinkston of Nature and Spirit. This episode, and every episode, is brought to you by the Human Intelligence Institute team. Thanks for listening to today's episode. As always, this episode is available online at humanintelligence.news.